Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson with the latest in the series of webinars for our great project, Evolution in Contextual Behavioral Science. Our topic for today is wellness in mental and physical health. And our two participants on the evolution side, we have Aaron Blaisdell at UCLA, and on the CBS side, we have Kelly Wilson down in Mississippi, where the temperature is only 85 degrees. So, Kelly, could you begin by providing a very brief description of yourself and your background, and then we'll do the same with Aaron.
Sure, David. I am a professor of psychology at the University of Mississippi. My specialty area is clinical psychology. Though I was trained in both clinical psychology and experimental analysis of behavior. So my PhD is in clinical psychology from the University of Nevada, Reno. I have was the first president of the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, and have spent my career sort of doing a stretch between basic experimental analysis of behavior and basic behavioral theory on the one hand, and clinical training and clinical theory on the other. I come from a lab tradition that tries to make that stretch from basic to applied science.
Awesome. Okay, Aaron.
Well, hello. So I'm also a professor of psychology at UCLA. But before I was in psychology, I kind of got my start getting an undergraduate degree at SUNY Stony Brook in anthropology. So I was studying evolution, human evolution, primate evolution. And then I kind of went off to Kent State University to continue that work, but I started shifting more into studying memory processes in living primates. And so doing foraging strategies and things like that. And I got a chance while I was there to work with somebody who does rat memory research in the psychology department. And so I started doing a little bit of research on the side with rat memory kind of learning using traditional behavioral techniques. And that was exciting. And so I decided to go on and study the mind psychologically that way, using the tools of experimental psychology. So I went to Binghamton University, where you are, David.
Yep.
That's where we overlapped for the first time when I was a grad student there in the late 90s. And I worked with Ralph Miller there on rat learning and memory kind of stuff. And then I did a short postdoc at Tufts University for a couple of years, learning how to work with pigeons, another typical animal model in the behavioral psychology tradition. But we were doing some cognition and perception work there. And then was lucky enough to land here in beautiful southern sunny California.
Where the temperature is only what?
Today it's in the mid 70s and
okay.
Beautiful. And I'm stuck in here doing this little webinar with you guys. I'm just kidding, but it is beautiful out. Yeah. And so I've been here since 2001, and I have a rat lab, a pigeon lab. I even work with humans occasionally and hermit crabs. I kind of stumbled into comparative psychology and thinking about evolutionary issues as well as kind of proximate mechanisms and how they meet from a comparative perspective.
Awesome. And I think one very special thing about this particular pairing is that you both have very strong credentials in behaviorism, basically the Skinnerian tradition. More so on Aaron's part than most of the evolutionists in the volume, with some exceptions. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun to explore. So Aaron, why don't you begin by describing your chapter, please?
Sure. So my chapter, the full title of my chapter is Evolutionary Mismatch, a framework for understanding health and disease in the modern world. And this idea of evolutionary mismatch is really kind of the crux of how I've been since about 2009, looking at a lot of modern disease and problems, unwellness, psychological problems, and other things in our modern environments are due to a mismatch between the modern environment in which we're developing and we find ourselves on the one hand, and the kind of ancestral environment that our Homo sapiens ancestors spent most of their evolutionary history, and the big difference between those two environments as being a source of a lot of the main problems, the major problems that we find. And so the chapter is about that issue. I kind of start with laying out a little bit about niche construction, an idea from biology about how animals can change their environments through their behaviors in ways that actually impact not only their lives, and it can actually boost their fitness, but change the lives of the ecology and the ecosystem around them. A beaver building dams is one example I used. And from there, I kind of jump off into how humans are niche constructing beyond what any other species has ever been capable of. I mean, to be able to bring Earth's atmosphere up into space so we can survive there for short amounts of time, to go underseas, to go and live in the Arctic Circle. It's just incredible what we've been able to do as a species. But with that, I talk about how this niche construction is kind of a double-edged sword, and really kind of has been getting us into trouble in the modern age. I want to read two paragraphs that really kind of lay the framework, the juxtaposition between the ancestral environment and the modern environment, the two paragraphs from my chapter.
Good.
Okay, that'll set the stage for the discussion today anyway. So, before turning to the various maladies brought on by evolutionary mismatch, let's first compare in very general terms the prototypical ancestral environment to the typical modern environment as experienced by people living in the modern age. The ancestral environment in which humans existed for over 99% of the time since the origin of Homo sapiens, around 500,000 years ago, consisted of living primarily in outside environments. Such environments are characterized as being nonlinear, with lots of fluctuations in light, temperature, elevation, activity, and sensory input. Daily interactions with a small number of familiar individuals ranging in age from infancy to elderly. A large portion of the day is spent procuring and preparing food, shelter, and other necessities of daily life. Consumption of foods that provide all of the necessary macro and micronutrients and that typically prevent nutrient deficiencies. Knowledge derived largely from one's own accumulated experiences and from direct conversation with members of a small community. And sleep patterns that are fairly consistent and that adequately, if not optimally, meet sleep requirements. Despite a tight integration within the social ecology, there is a great deal of freedom and personal autonomy in how daily activities are arranged and choices are made. And there is no clear separation of the self from the group or the environment. The Western industrial society, on the other hand, is characterized as being highly linear, living in carpentered environments with much less range of motion when sitting, like I am right now, standing or walking, with the majority of time spent indoors, protected from fluctuations in temperature, light, activity, and sensory input, resulting in a large degree of homogeneity in those stimuli. A large portion of the day is spent in proscribed activity, either school, if you're a child or an adolescent, or work as an adult. Long periods of stasis, such as sitting at a desk job or school, and daily connections to a much smaller social group, often of a restricted age range, while at the same time encountering brief superficial connections to a much wider number of individuals. Furthermore, in modern households, parents are burdened with arranging schedules, feeding, entertainment, and even social activities for their pre-adult children. which poses tight time constraints that curtails the freedom of parents to engage in autonomous and social activities, curtails the freedom of children too, by the way, such as cultivating meaningful relationships with same-sex friends. Thus, unlike ancestral state, as evidenced from contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, fathers rarely have the freedom to spend time with their male friends, and mothers are rarely connected throughout the day to a peer group of other female friends that would offer social support and share in daily living tasks, including childcare. So those are the paragraphs that kind of set the stage. And then what I do in the chapter is I lay out nine actually examples. I won't go through all of them. I'll just list what those examples are. And we can, during the discussion, we'll be talking about these things because there's a lot of connections with Kelly's work. So those evolutionary mismatch topic points I discussed are food, activity, our surroundings, light exposure, education, social life, parenting, social structures and governance, so societal, and what I call cognitive grounding. So I'll wrap up with that.
Awesome. Okay. Kelly.
Okay. Well, this chapter sort of has its beginnings for me. A conversation that I had with David in
Yes.
2009. I think it was in the wintertime. And I was out in Eugene doing a workshop, and my good friend Tony Bigland conspired to put us in the same room at the same time. And David was my first evolutionary biologist at an ACT workshop.
And you were my first mentor in ACT training. So the student-teacher relationship ran both ways.
Very, very good. Well, David asked me a question that sort of long weekend there at Tony's place that I've come to understand that he asks all scientists. And the question was something like, do you look at your own discipline through the lens of evolution science? And I think I was a little defensive probably initially because, like, of course, and I always thought of myself as, evolution friendly and taught a little bit about evolution science. And you can't really teach behavior analysis without teaching things like selection and retention and that sort of thing. But the question troubled me, and the way these things work for me is it kind of percolated for a while, and eventually I got that he was asking a much more fundamental question than the one that I was answering. And the question, I think, was, the quotation that comes to mind is Dobzhansky's assertion that nothing makes sense in biology except in light of evolution. And it wasn't until that summer that I had a personal experience that sort of connected the dots for me. I started reading some evolution science and trying to put these things together, and it didn't exactly click. And I was doing an ACT workshop in Sweden a few months after that. And I asked people in the workshop to think of the face of someone who they loved with all their heart, someone who they loved like crazy. And then I asked them to do this harder thing. I asked them to imagine that they were someone who they loved like that, and what they might offer themselves. Now, right before this, I had done this joke. So in ACT, we teach about values and about connecting behavior change repertoires to what people value most. And, I always took this kind of very casual posture towards which values people worked on. And so I had this big joke I would tell right before I launched into that part. And so my big joke was, for example, this value of self-care, I'm in the H.L. Mencken School of Self-Care. Whenever I get the urge to strong physical exercise, I lie down until it passes.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, everyone in the room laughed and I laughed. But then when I was doing this exercise and I was imagining the face, and in that instance, I imagined the face of one of my daughters, and asked this, you know, imagine that you were someone who you loved like that. Then suddenly my joke was not so funny anymore. And you know, I had this kind of moment of clarity of sort of like, when did it become okay for me to neglect myself? And when did it become okay for me to joke about that neglect? And then I came back to evolution science with this kind of a sense of personal connection. And I started to ask this question, like, if you understand us as an evolved being, and you wanted to take really good care of one of us, what would we need? And that just sort of took me down the rabbit hole. As I started to look at what I thought were the seeds of the epidemic of certain kinds of mental health problems in the modern world, where I found myself was at what I consider to be the sort of epicenter of pretty much everything that is killing us in the developed world. So the way my chapter is laid out is it begins with a reality check, because there's so much gloom and doom being espoused in, you know, everywhere in the world today, which is wrong, I think. And so one of the places that I start is to suggest that if you had to drop a child into an inhabited part of the world and hope for them to live a long and prosperous life, that there has never in the history of humankind ever been a time better than right now at this moment. And I tick off a couple, like, for example, that child mortality has fallen by an order of magnitude in the last 200 years, from 43% to 4.3% globally. That maternal mortality has dropped 2 orders of magnitude, from 1,000 deaths per 100,000 live births to fewer than 10. These are astonishing changes for the better. And even in the most troubled parts of the world, life expectancy, infant mortality is far better than it was even in the wealthiest places in Europe 200 years ago.
So three cheers for niche construction.
Yes, yeah. I mean,
no, that's important. And both of your papers start that way. I think it's very important. Before we get to mismatch, we have to say 3 cheers for niche construction.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a massively misunderstood area. I mean, people have this idea that you know, the world is like, you know, on the is just getting worse and worse and worse. And I mean, you know, you go back 200 years, we were burying half of our children, you know, before their 5th birthday. This is a big deal. Even like in the last 30 years,
totally.
1 billion people have been lifted out of the lowest levels of poverty.
I've been reading political biographies of Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the number of bad things happened at that time: paralysis and death, and you know, all kinds of stuff. Even, you know, back then, less than 100 years ago, as you were saying.
Yeah, it really is the Industrial Revolution where you really start to get some astonishing benefits, and it's accelerating. So if people think it was like the good old days up to the 50s, they're just wrong, you know. All the people who are like, oh yeah, we didn't wear any helmets when we rode our bicycles. Yeah, and quite a significant number of you died before, you know, the ones who were talking of it are the ones that survived. So anyway, I do a little bit of that. I talk a little bit about this mismatch issue, not at tremendous length because I anticipated that Aaron would talk about that some, but just sort of like that, you know, evolution favored our ancestors who picked the easy path up the hill, you know, who preferred the energy dense foods, which was a pretty safe bet up until very, 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 very recently. And I talk a little bit about, like things like going from, there are estimates that we ate about 4 pounds of sugar per year in colonial America. The current estimates are like 120 pounds a year. I mean, it's just, and so I talked a little bit about the mismatch. Then I talk a little bit about acceptance and commitment therapy, really as a set of practices. So not really as a therapy as much as some things that people can practice. And, ACT consists of, openness to experience. So, teaching people to practice acceptance, practice holding the thoughts that they have lightly, practices that teach people to, continually engage in the moments that they are inhabiting, practices that cultivate valued domains of living, and practices that have to do with, given this valued domain of living, and you're going to put your foot on the ground and step forward in that area, what would a step like that look like? I think that these things have to do with not just what we need to change, but some psychological practices that can make change easier to do. I, like Aaron, picked a couple of areas. I could have picked 50. I picked 5. Exposure to excessive exposure to toxins of a wide variety. Our habitual movement patterns, or actually more problematically, our lack of movement patterns, the food environment, the sleep environment, and social network, and our kind of connection to social network. And I ticked through some of those with a pretty practical bent, focused a little less on the mismatch and a little more on, here's some things you could look at in your own life that you might be able to create some change. And then the last bit of the chapter are some kind of, if you're behavioral enough, you'll recognize some of these as, shaping by successive approximations and like that. But I kind of tick off some things that, what I'm really thinking about is, because I work with people directly on how to change behavior. And so I think about some of the things that end up being obstacles for people in moving ahead in behavior change. So some things like small things matter and everything interacts. Sometimes when people think about lifestyle change, it's so big that they can't start, or they start too big and crash themselves in a excessive dieting or excessive movement practices. So I kind of tick through some of these sort of small ways that I think we can sort of orient people towards lifestyle change that are, I think, a little gentler, a little kinder, and maybe a little more likely that people could adhere to them.
Awesome. Okay. Well, this is so great. Now, I know both of you, and I know that both of you actually have put this kind of thing into practice in your own lives. And I think it would be very interesting to explore that just a little bit. I know in Aaron's case, you had some severe physical problems, basically, that you think were addressed by changing your practices. And Kelly, I'll let you tell your own story. But Aaron, could you begin and just say, how do you apply this in your own life, in addition to studying it professionally and counseling others?
Sure. It first started for me back in about 2008, 2009. And I kind of came across all these paleo diet blogs, which that was kind of in the early days. And so I started tinkering in my own life. Well, what happened if I took out most of the processed foods I was eating, and all grains and breads, pastas and sugars, and actually went low carb, because I was also reading Gary Taub's Good Calories, Bad Calories. And he was championing the idea that sugar and refined carbohydrates are really the source of a lot of physical health. problems. And so I tried, low carb paleo type diet. And after about a year on that, I really slimmed down, even though I was already slim. My waist went down in a belt size or two. And I found I had a lot more energy than I used to. I didn't get kind of the afternoon slump that I used to always get, plagued me all my life. I think I had hyporeactive glycemia, where if I ate a meal, especially if I had some carbohydrate in it, then about an hour or so later, I would get a slump because it would be cleared out of the bloodstream from the overzealous insulin response or something. Oh, that's gone. I mean, I don't have those problems anymore. But I think actually the most profound change, as you were hinting at, is that I have this genetic disorder that I inherited from my mom's side of my family, and she has it. My brother has it. Her brother, my mom's brother, has it. Her father had it. I mean, it's really expressed really strongly in the family, and it's called porphyria. And the kind that we have in our family, I'll just call it EPP, which stands for erythropoietic protoporphyria. Say that really fast. EPP. It's a rare, really rare type of porphyria, and it's a family of diseases. And that one of the things with people who have porphyria is they tend to be very sensitive to sunlight. And so I had to avoid sunlight pretty much all my life, and just brief exposures, get out of it when I could. Otherwise, I get burning, inflamed skin. Any area of the skin that was exposed to the sunlight would gradually become very inflamed and burning, feeling more like a wind burn than like a sunburn. So like a constant, even when not touching, a constant burny, prickly, really terrible. And then about a year into being pretty religiously on this low carb paleo diet, because I felt so great on it, I spent an afternoon with my wife out in the sun, forget what we were doing, but I was out in the sun much longer than I should have been. I was like, oh man, it's going to be one of those rough evenings and nights. I knew I was just going to be in for having a porphyria reaction. Nothing. Didn't get any reaction at all. In fact, I started to get a little bit of a sunburn on my shoulders and my lower neck. And I was really surprised. And so actually I started experimenting with that. Like, well, how much sun can I handle? And I'm in Southern California. It's pretty sunny in the summer. How much sun can I handle before I start feeling that reaction? I would never get the reaction. And to this day, basically, my porphyria is in remission, except for probably about 5 years ago when my older daughter was about 6 years old. And you get invited to all the obligatory birthday parties with all the other 5 and 6 year olds that are in their daycare or preschool or elementary school. And I would be there, and there would be all the chips and this and that. And I would be like, all right, I've been doing great on my diet. I'm feeling great. That was fall. I remember this, and all the birthday season was upon us. And I would start snacking on those foods at the parties. Have a little bit of cake, and have some chips and Doritos and things like that. I was pretty much had excised from my diet up to that point. And that during that fall is when I started noticing my porphyria symptoms coming back when I would be out in the sun. So I just cut all that stuff back out again, and within a few weeks, it was in remission again. So I think having a genetic disorder like that has such an environmental expression it really clued me into how critical this piece is about lifestyle and evolutionary mismatch. And so now I've learned to walk as much as I can in bare feet or minimalist shoes. I heard Kelly over email was telling me he's going barefoot trail running. And I think that's great. I go outside with bare feet and walk on uneven surfaces and rocks and bricks. It feels just so different to retrain the feet to feel, to be your sensory organs that are integrating with the world underneath you in such an intimate way. And so I try and put all these kinds of ideas into practice in my own life. Another example, I'll shut up in a minute, but another example is with light exposure. I do occasionally look at screens at night, but I have these, I put on my computer Flux, which is a nice program that takes out all the blues. And the blue light is what will suppress melatonin production, which is what you need at night when the cortisol production goes down, melatonin production goes up. It leads to the regulation of sleep and falling asleep. Well, blue screens from TVs, computers, and devices will interfere with that production and can then dysregulate your sleep and that has a lot of impact on your immune system and inflammation and things. And so I've learned to use it. I generally minimize the use of any kind of screens after dusk. And then when I do use them, I've learned to be smart about it with programs like Flux that I install on my computer to take the blues out at night, so they automatically knows when the sun's setting from the clock on the computer. It takes those filters out of the screen, and then I'm not being exposed to the melatonin suppressing part of the spectrum. I also have these orange glasses that block the blue light as well, that I'll wear in the evening in case we have some lights on in the house that are emitting full spectrum light. I've actually replaced some of the light bulbs, especially my reading lamp next to my bed, with orange spectrum light that doesn't emit any blue spectrum. So these are the things I've taken to help my sleep hygiene, as it's called, to really normalize my day-night circadian rhythm. And so these are all the kind of things that I practice, and I try and encourage people. I talk about it and I write about it with other people. And also I've, even as you know, started a whole society with the annual symposium dedicated to this idea of mismatch and our modern day health and wellness, and in all different facets, and how we can understand and take back our lives by understanding these mismatches and trying to correct them.
That's the Ancestral Health Society. We'll provide a link to it.
Thanks.
Okay, so thank you so much, Kelly.
This is a great match. One thing is that I had, the Ancestral Health Society, because of being an active academic, my travel schedule is completely like insane. But that one has been kind of on my radar, and I've been thinking, man, I gotta find a way to get that into my schedule. And I'm guessing this conversation is going to lead to that.
Excellent.
The other thing that's very interesting to me is that Aaron and my timeline is pretty close to the same. I had that conversation with David, I think, in the winter of '09, and in the summer of '09, I came home from that workshop and started a yoga practice. It was the first thing that I did, and there's a psychologist, Carl Rogers, a great humanistic psychologist, said in his 1961 book, "That which is most personal is most general." And I've sort of bet my career on that. And this is another one of those areas where I've sort of bet my career on that. I started taking myself to yoga, and in the summer of 2009. I could barely do anything. Decades of being incredibly careless about my physical well-being. My diet was not completely awful because my wife is paying attention to like what the kids are eating and stuff like that. But really, like Aaron, I mean, man, if I had to guess, I would guess that I was probably getting, 90% of my calories from ultra processed foods. I didn't really do anything with that initially, though. I started that yoga practice, and it wasn't much. I couldn't do very much. I spent almost all my time for months and months in gentle yoga for special needs. And, I was in there with like the surgery recovering patients and the very elderly. And my favorite yoga teacher likes to joke that, I came to the prenatal classes and people like always laugh. And she's like, no, really, and because I just couldn't do very much physically. I had so little mobility and flexibility and strength. And it was a remarkable thing. Like I got the kindness and care that was in that. And as soon as I sort of got that, then, I started looking out into these other areas, and the next box that got ticked was a diet. And my good friend Troy Dufresne sent me some links, including Gary Taubes, and I started reading, about the bitter truth about sugar. And I have to say that initially I was just sort of gobsmacked, like like when I took all that stuff out of my diet, it was almost like, what do I eat? You know, now I sort of look back and I think, you know, what was the mystery? You know, because you know what I eat now is food. You know, pretty much subsist on a diet of food. You know, like if it has a label, it's probably not great news. Now, I mean, I'm not, you know, monkish about this or anything, and I expect, and my read of the literature is that there's a lot of variability, including genetic variability, in what people can tolerate and not tolerate. But, you know, I'm a clinical psychologist. This, you know, I started making these kinds of changes, and that yoga practice went on for a few years. When I turned 60, I started running. Within about 3 or 4 months, I started barefoot running. And I am a barefoot running like maniac. Like I'm out on the trails 3-4 times a week. You know, I have 0 distance goals. I have 0 pace goals. And I even told Aaron that my running, you know, I kind of put it in scare quotes because I don't know that any runner would claim it. Because, you know, my idea of running, my model of running is I think about myself when I was 8 or 10 years old, running through the woods in Western Washington. And, you know, I was astonishingly fit as a child, and I had no fitness goals, none at all, you know. And, you know, how long did I run? Well, until I didn't feel like running any further. How fast? Well, until it seemed like it was fast enough, you know. How long? Well, until my side hurt a little bit, or until my brother slowed down, you know. And so now I think about, you know, myself and my pals, my brothers when we were kids, when I go out and run like that. And, you know, so I sprint up the hills. If I see a tree down in the woods, I mean, I think about like when I was a kid, if I was walking through the woods and I saw a tree down, there's no chance in the world that I would walk by that. I would have to get up on that tree and see if I could walk from one end to the other, you know, and, you know, maintain my balance. And, you know, so I'm out there, I catch frogs, I take pictures of mushrooms, you know, I squat up on tree stumps. If a branch offers itself, I do a little brachiating. I don't do it alone. I talk about it to anyone and everyone who will listen. I've even got a cheer for my daughter, Emma, you know, 2, 4, 6, 8, come on, Emma, let's brachiate. So she brachiates with me, you know, I had a rotator cuff tear and got onto some people who suggested you could remodel your body by including some of these other movement patterns. And now, and for me, like I am a guy who carries a crazy number of vulnerabilities. And I've had myself genotyped, you know, beyond the 23andMe version. And I know that I carry a variety of different genetic variants that put me at risk for a number of problems. And in fact, my own mother buried more than half of her children before she passed. And you know, so I lost a brother in 1987 to suicide. I lost a brother in 2011. He was 36 years old. I lost a brother in 2011 to a massive cerebral bleed. He was 53 years old. And I lost my baby brother, Michael, in 2013 at the age of 47 of a heart attack. And sometimes we'll put that up when I'm talking about this stuff in public places. And then I put up a picture of my mom's generation in 2013, all 6 of them still alive. So, you know, I tell people, do I think there's such thing as family-wise risk? You bet. But I'm also at risk for this, you know, and, you know, I show them this like whole, you know, and I think in certain ways, my, like, you know, you were talking about the kind of this, like at the personal level, like in my own family, in a single generation, you can sort of see the impact of the just astonishing changes that have happened in the world in the last 50 years. one generation, a retreat to mortality levels that, are and I'm not alone, of course. I mean, white males especially, but we've actually flattened that growth in health.
That's the one category that actually is getting worse. So
yes. And if you look at what it is, it's suicide and poisonings, drug and alcohol poisonings, modern world illnesses.
And Kelly, you mentioned how there's so much individual variability that's genetic. I think there's also so much individual variability that's coming from the environment. For example, I wasn't breastfed after the first couple of weeks, and my brother wasn't at all. We were started pretty quickly on the bottle. That changes the whole way your face, the architecture develops. Sleep apnea is at epidemic proportions now. It's related to this kind of idea. The changes in microbiome due to pesticide use and or herbicide use like Roundup, and how it's actually a lot of links between that and destroying microbiome in the way that you no longer can tolerate foods that normally in human society we've been able to tolerate. It's just amazing how much variability is due to these ontogenetic factors.
Well, one thing that I learned in a lecture, I'd have to remember the speaker, is that if you look at skulls archaeologically from pre-industrial times, the front teeth meet the back teeth at the front. The bite, the front, the top and bottom teeth meet each other. In modern life, nobody does that. Like almost 100%, the front teeth come in front of the top teeth come in front of the bottom teeth. So all of us are malformed, basically, as far as our dental morphology is concerned. We don't even know what the norm is. You'd have to go back into archaeological specimens. Now, I want to address the issue now of this is so important and has such transformative effects, and yet can be very difficult to study scientifically, and is often accused of being junk science, you might say, fad science, like the paleo diet. And maybe that's justified and maybe it's not. But I actually think that there's possibly reasons why this kind of thing is difficult to study. We've already mentioned some of them, a lot of individual variability, for example. So that works for one individual. What's critical for one individual might not be for others. Ancestry might have a huge thing to do with it, environmental factors and so on. So all of these things are complex problems. And so how do we do good science, and how do we protect against a veering in a faddish direction? I'm asking this to two people that are very accomplished scientists.
Well, this is, and of course, the reason it gets tarred as junk science is because there's so much junk out there. Oh my God, if you start reading, especially like I think probably the worst is like things on diet. I mean, there's just some like unbelievable stupid stuff out there on the interwebs that you can find out about diet. It's amazing. I sort of follow, and as far as the complexity and the doing good science on it, some of it, there's a kind of a principle that I try to teach students when I teach them this, and it's this sort of the good enough science. So there is just wacky stuff out there, but when you start going, like to good sources, you have to settle for good enough. Because, for example, the number of people in the population who are taking, like Aaron was talking about microbiome and toxin exposure to that. One huge exposure that we get is casual use of medications. An enormous percentage of the population is taking like 5 or more medications. There are no randomized clinical trials on that, and there never will be. There never will be, because no institutional review board in their right mind, like if you send them a protocol and said, oh, we want to take these vulnerable, ill people and expose them to 5 different medications, they'd be like, are you out of your mind? if you look at like
well, on top of that, I've learned that if you do a drug trial and you find that there's short-term benefits, that says nothing about long-term effects. And in fact, there's an argument to be said that those will be actually reversed. So that
and we know that it is true in many cases. Like, for example, I was on proton pump inhibitors for a dozen years after I had head and neck cancer. I had not enough saliva, which leads to, kind of chronic gastrointestinal vulnerability. So I took these proton pump inhibitors for like a dozen years. Well, what I know now, and it took me about a year and a half of a gradual walk down and learning how to manage my gut. I've been off them for 5 or 6 years now. But you can induce gastrointestinal symptoms in healthy adults by as little as 8 weeks of exposure to proton pump inhibitors. So you can take people without GI problems and give them GI problems in as little as 8 weeks of exposure. Now, of course, the label always says, up to 14 days or something. But that's not what the commercials say. The commercials say it's un-American to not eat your chili dog. If you look at something like food, you have foods with hundreds of ingredients. Just think about the scientific, like in principle, you could test them all, but in practice, could you?
So what can you do?
Well, here's what you can do.
What's the way to proceed?
Well, here's what you can do, is that you can not eat things that are not necessary, that have no nutritional value. So for example, one of the ones that I point out to students all the time, I've actually got one of the students Snapchatted the portion where I was talking about it, is I'm reading and natural ingredients, right? This is a way the food companies hide ingredients that they don't want to tell you about. One of them is something called castoreum. This is in vanilla and berry flavored things, for example. What it comes from is the anal glands of beavers. So I'm telling my students about this. Now, do I think beaver, of course it is natural, right? What could be more natural than a beaver's ass? But, and do I think it's dangerous? Probably not. But is it necessary? No. And so, for me, the deal killer is I look at labels, and I aim to punish companies for putting many, many ingredients in products. So I look for products.
That doesn't, Kelly, that doesn't get at my question. That's a good precautionary policy and all that, but it's not getting at the science. How do we actually demonstrate that something is or is not good for you, especially when it's so contextual? It does get back to context. What we're saying is that these things are richly contextual. And so therefore, how do we proceed scientifically when these things are so contextual?
Well, here's the problem, though, David, is that argument, we don't have any evidence that this is bad, is exactly the kind of science. This is like the doubt factory that is run by Big Food, where they say, there isn't evidence for X. So, and I don't think we can wait for the science. And so, my rule is there a downside to leaving this out? And I can't figure out any downside to not eating foods that have ingredients that are not food. In the meantime, we need to sort those things out. But, we have a generation that was fed on trans fats that are now known to drive all manner of metabolic and psychological problems. Now, we didn't have to eat those trans fats. And so, yes, we need to do the science. A lot of it is going to be complex. In the meantime, I think that there are actionable things that people can do. And we need to avoid the smoke screen that, Big Food is putting up, with the sort of doubt science that they, populate the planet with.
Darren, what's your answer to my question about how do we proceed scientifically?
Well, I agree with Kelly on taking matters into your own hands and using these rules of thumb, these principles of if it's something that's recently been introduced to our environment and hasn't been vetted necessarily then let's just do without it so guilty until proven innocent, I think, is that precautionary tale, which I think is usually applied in medicine, I think should really be applied on a policy-wide spectrum for anytime any new ingredients, or even things like BPA lining in cans and all the kind of things that are invented and by industry and then utilized in products that we're consuming, not just are affecting our health, but also the environment. I think that as a society, we have to start trying to encourage society, and I don't know exactly the best way to do this, but encourage society and the policymakers to really take this more precautionary principle towards industry. And it's not, that wasn't an answer to your question about how do we do better.
Yeah, that's a gentlemen, that was a good answer to a different question.
Exactly.
So now let's get back to the science.
I'm coming back to what I was going to say though, is wrapping back. I just wanted to bounce off what Kelly was saying, but wrapping back to your question, I think one of the problems with the science out there is that a majority of it probably is not actually science. If you want to know one of the most influential academic institutions that is influencing nutritional policy, it would be the Harvard School of Public Health. What does the Harvard School of Public Health rely on as their data set? Are they in laboratories testing rigorously every single ingredient to see whether or not it has a negative or a positive health impact on humans? No. They're collecting observational data, we call epidemiological science, and they're trying to apply statistical techniques to remove confounding variables, which is impossible really to do in an effective way, so that they can try and derive cause-effect relationships between things they're measuring. Like, well, smoking would be a classic example, but then more modern examples would be how much red meat do you consume and how much sugar do you consume. And even with sugar, I would say, sure, the correlational data are very strong, the epidemiology, but you can't, I think it's unwise, let me put it this way, it's unwise to make policy on observational science, which is really good at generating hypotheses that can then be and should be tested scientifically with more laboratory empirical based work.
Well, could we say that plus more? We don't want to do away with that kind of science, but we want to supplement it. Is that?
Exactly. We don't want, what I'm saying is we don't want to say, okay, we should start recommending, to cut down on, let's say, red meat, because people who report in surveys eating more red meat also are shown to have a higher risk of, the mortality rate is higher for, let's say, heart attack or something. Then it's sure, now investigate the hypothesis, but I don't think you could take epidemiological data, which is typically what's done, and the dietary review panel does this every 5 years, and to make policy decisions and to shape the policy structure of what they tell everybody in this country that they should be eating and they shouldn't be eating. So I think a lot of the times the big problem, and the media gets caught up with this, the headline that says red meat can do this, it's bad. The next week, red meat actually is a source of this, it's really good for you. And then the week after, red meat is bad. And this ping pong back and forth is a lot of it's because they're taking something out of context. Oftentimes it's epidemiology, and they're reporting it as if it's a causal effect. So I think, first of all, we have to understand, well, what do we mean by science and what isn't science?
Well, I want to know if CBS, Contextual Behavioral Science, offers any kind of a model for this, because CBS is exemplary for its scientific approach to such things as ACT therapy. It's even proceeded to the point where it does component analysis, whether this particular feature of ACT therapy works or doesn't work, and so on. So I'm wondering if there's something there that could be expanded to include some of these things which are not typically associated with ACT.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, I think that CBS brings this kind of contextual view. So when you start asking questions about better or worse, it depends on the endpoint, depends on what else is going on. And there's a lot of it depends on. I think we're going to have to settle for some a lot of good enough science along the way. It really isn't a question for a single discipline. So, like, for example, I think that the sugar evidence is important, the epidemiological evidence, but I also think, like, the basic laboratory evidence, for example, you can expose baby rats to free access to a 25% sugar solution. And it will alter the regulation of a GR gene. So, genes having to do with regulation of stress response. It'll alter genes that impact neurological flexibility. In a way that is similar to, like, if you kind of look at the expression of these genes in these rats that have free access to this 25% sugar solution, what it does to the regulation of these genes is similar to the disruption of these patterns of gene regulation if you take the mother rat and expose her to conditions where she's basically having to have her babies on a bare floor. So no nesting materials, right? It operates as a stressor on the system in the same way. Now, of course, what the sugar industry would say is, but mice are not men. You can make anything
well,
happen.
I want to actually dwell on that, because that might seem like a cheap shot, but actually the whole concept of mismatch does call into question the whole model organism context, because if these things are good or bad depending on your ancestral environment, then the ancestral environment of a rat or a mouse or a pigeon is very different, including, for example, grains in the diet, which is something which is part of the ancestral environment for mice, not humans. So therefore, you should be able to feed mice grains, no problem. That says nothing about humans. So how does the concept of model organisms survive the mismatch concept?
Well, some models hold and some models don't. And they hold where they hold. And what a CBS perspective would say, there's nothing that intrinsically says that they're going to hold, but they hold where they hold. Like if you take something like movement, moderate to vigorous physical activity, you can model depression and anxiety in rats by restricting their physical activity. You can generate social distress in pairs that are housed together. Like you put one inside of the thing like that. You can model, social distresses in there. You can also predict psychological health in humans by knowing something about their movement patterns. You can also cure psychological problems by enhancing movement patterns. So when you see a convergence of these data, to me, when I look at my own practice, that's what I'm looking for, is that kind of convergence of bench science, of models. I get mice are not men, but like if I'm like in a room, a bare room, and a mouse eats something and dies, and then another mouse eats it and dies, and then another mouse eats it and dies, I'm going to wait for something else to eat to show up. It might not be the best science, but
Well, I have to share my own personal story. Aaron, you go first, and then I'm going to very briefly share my own personal story. Then I want to switch gears to one more major topic before we're done. But Aaron, please.
Okay, I agree with Kelly that they're different. You have to think about the model and how does it apply to as a model for a human. And so, as you were saying, David, the mice and rats, they're grainivores. They've actually evolved in the context of that's one of their things they eat. The dietary staples for them is seeds and grains. And so when humans started eating them about 10,000 years ago and started storing them at the dawn of agriculture, we were storing rat food and mouse food, which is why vermin became such a big problem. And so when we're doing modern studies, even in my own lab, where I've shown that diet high in sugar will dysregulate the cognition and motivation in the rat, their control group was eating a diet that had a fair bit of grain, including wheat in it. And for a rat, that would be a more ancestral type diet. maybe not for a human. And so knowing something about the evolutionary history and the ecology of the organism that you're picking, I think doesn't take a lot of effort to do that and to understand whether or not that would be a good animal model. For example, with the pigeon's a great animal model in which to study a lot of human behavior. As Skinner has shown, they're showing lots of the same responses to schedules of reinforcement, how reinforcers depend upon the behavior of the organism. And that kind of work maps on beautifully to the way humans also interfacing with their environment and the reward structure of that environment. So I think basically you understand enough about the organism and you do some work where it then cross-validates with human work going back.
Yeah, so it's a highly iterative, I'll answer my own question. It's a highly iterative process.
Right.
Well, here's my story. I went on a gluten-free diet, and I thought there were great effects. I thought my brain fog cleared up, I lost weight, all that kind of stuff. And then I thought, I really want to test this. I want to be more scientific about it. So I used the experience sampling method, the famous beeper method, where you get signaled at random times during the day. And then I went 3 weeks, on my gluten-free diet on the beeper method. And then I added wheat back into my diet. And I was actually astonished by how little I learned from that. Why? Because these things are not like turning on and off a light switch. When you add wheat back into your diet, weeks might need to go by before these things happen. And so the signal to noise ratio was too great.
Actually, if I could just interject on wheat, and for me, it's about 2 days. I don't get that day, and even the next day, I don't have a noticeable response. But 2 days in, that's when I get the response.
Yeah, but when you add in placebo effects and the way you're thinking about it and what you want to happen and so on, I thought, golly, I went to all this work and I don't know much more actually for having done the experience sampling method than I did before. So right. There's not a moral to that story, except actually I want to push it one step further, because it seems to me, with so many people interested in this, that there should be a way to organize what amounts to randomized control trials, or at least things that are like clinical studies, except they're done on a sort of self-organizing basis with a large population of people that merely need to be organized, as opposed to expensive medical trials, which none of us are in a position to conduct. So what is the prospect for actually harnessing the interest, the many thousands of people that are actually passionately interested in this, and organizing their activities to the point where you could actually do good science? You could call it open source science. Is that being done, and is it a possibility?
I don't think it's being done, but it ought to be. And we've never lived at a time where the chance to do it was better. You say, David, that you didn't learn that much, but I think you did learn something. And this is exactly what I encourage people to do: tinker. Tinker, do it for a period of time, see what happens. And the other thing is, is there a downside in there? And I would say there's no downside to like not eating wheat or eating wheat. To your issue of the type of science, this kind of open source science, though, I think it's a magnificent idea. And I think that we've never lived at a time where it was more possible to do.
I know a couple of people who tried to start something like this and they couldn't get the funding to do it. Maybe now there are more platforms for raising funds, crowdsourcing. Maybe they'd be able to get the funding off the ground.
Yeah, the trick would be to do it without funds, or to make it self-supporting. That if 1,000 people wanted to do this and they all chipped in $10, then you'd have some funds to do it. But mostly it would be organizational, and then people would pay for their own involvement. Basically they'd get a physician to do the medical test, whatever, but they'd have some guidance as to what to do. So you had standardized measures and things like that. So
the closest thing I can think of to this is there's a project called the American Gut Project. And it's a group of, it's the biggest, I think it is the biggest crowdsourced science project ever. You can send them money and you can get your your microbiome genotyped. So you can like take samples from your mouth, stool samples, and the entire data, it's an open data set. You know, that kind of project, I mean, I'm not saying—
and the human DNA research is like that. 23andMe and the National Geographic and things like that are actually a bit like that, basically. So they're running on the contributions of individuals.
No, if I can just say something, those methods are going to be very important to have that kind of open science, open source science for large scale scientific research. But I really think that there's so much more that we could leverage from self-experimentation, the tinkering method, doing it smartly. If we can teach people how to do it smartly, and it doesn't take much to learn how to do this, and that this kind of is really probably has the most power because it's individualized medicine. And we need more individualized therapies. And I think a lot of it also has to do with, and this will touch on what Kelly's expertise is, the behavioral techniques that we can offer people in our daily lives, learning how to, because it's basically a skill. You're learning to small steps to build up your skills that work for you and rewriting your own narrative. I think teaching people to do these kinds of things are going to have the most bang for the buck and offer people the most help.
Yeah, well, that actually segues to my final big topic that I want to discuss with you, which has to do with ACT training against the background of our native learning abilities. So, I mean, we're getting a lot of mileage about thinking about, starting with Skinner, selection by consequences, of thinking of operative conditioning learning as an evolutionary process in its own right. And then with relational frame theory, we're providing an overlay of language and symbolic thought, which goes beyond Skinner. And I think one of the insights from that, it's like a personalized mismatch, is that we know the one thing everyone needs to know about evolution is it often takes where you don't want to go. And what's adaptive in the evolutionary sense of the word is not normatively good. Adaptive in the everyday sense of the word, and actually a very large fraction of problems, both social problems and personal problems, are adaptive in the evolutionary sense of the word. For example, through a reinforcement process that led in a dysfunctional direction, such as families that have negatively reinforce each other for obnoxious behavior and things like that. So what ACT therapy does is to kind of manage the process of personal evolution. And so there's a sense in which it's a form of niche construction, that we're actually creating an environment, a kind of a cognitive environment or social environment or something like that, which is then steering the evolutionary process in more healthful directions, both personally and socially. So both of you are so well qualified to talk about what I just outlined. If you could just give me your versions or amend it however you see fit, but just comment on this, please.
Go ahead.
Kelly, why don't you take this?
Oh, well, okay. Well, and I talk a little bit about it in my chapter also, is I talk about, and I think the piece that ACT really gives you is, if you look at the distinction between short-term contingencies and long-term contingencies, there's a little thing called the matching law. Herrnstein came up with this idea, and it's a way to quantitatively predict how animals will distribute their behavior. And what the matching law basically says is that people will distribute their behavior, animals will distribute their behavior in a way that matches the availability of reinforcers. And the things that we know about reinforcers is immediate reinforcement is good, and big reinforcers are better than small reinforcers. And the problem is we have like this plethora of amazing, I mean, I'm within steps of an amount of like energy rich food that, whole communities, couldn't have hoped for.
So a lot of the mismatches we've been talking about are actually mediated through the matching law, basically.
Well, certainly, yeah. But I mean, the problem is we're just doing what evolution said: take the easy path up the hill, prefer the energy-rich foods. I mean, but here's the deal, though, is when it comes down to like for example, and I think this is the piece that Skinner talked about what he called defective contingencies, and what he meant by defective contingencies were contingencies where the difference was small and incremental or delayed. And the problem with small, incremental, and delayed reinforcers is they just don't work that well. ACT, I think, in the values work in ACT in particular, what it allows is to bring these small incremental reinforcers into this moment right here. So for example, I get, people who say, well, self-care, that just doesn't interest me. And I'm like, oh, really? What does interest you? Very often people will say, oh, my kids, my family, like that. And I'm like, okay. So here's what your kids are going to learn. They're not going to listen to what you say because that's just not how kids are, but they're going to watch you, right? And if they watch you, make sure that everybody else's needs are met, then and that you neglect yourself and even joke about your own self-care, is this cool? And so, and people, it doesn't take very long for people to get that the things that are the biggest, most important things in their life, they start to evaluate, what will I do next? Not in terms of the most proximal reinforcers, but in terms of these more distal, more incremental, slower moving sets of contingencies. So, I think about the, like when I take myself out for a run, that's an act of self-care, but it's also like being dad, because I know I just raised the probability that my kids.
Well, you just helped me make a connection, because in the moment, which is like a mindfulness-based term,
yes,
also could be thought of in a learning sense as immediate reinforcement. So
that's exactly.
I think that's that's very interesting. I had not made that connection.
This is absolutely correct. What values deliver for you is that moment where I put myself in my truck and start to head out to the trail. In that moment, I'm being the dad I want to be. I'm being the mentor I want to be. I'm being the member of the community that I want to be in that moment. I don't have to wait until later, because I'm in the pattern. And values work in ACT is about patterns of activity. It's not about some big outcome. It's about the pattern of activity. In intellectual disabilities, or you do something called reinforcer. You would evaluate what the best reinforcer is. So before you worked with anybody, you'd lay an array of different reinforcers out in front of them, and you find out what's the best reinforcer. For laboratory animals, you can establish preference by establishing a little bit of deprivation, for food or water, or you can, something like rats, they love them some sugar. So, give them a little sugar availability. So, but with humans and freely moving adult humans, the things that are the biggest have the biggest reinforcement value for you are almost all things that involve these really extended patterns over time. Being a husband, being a teacher, being a dad. And we can create contexts. Like I create a niche around myself. We're talking about what is most valuable is a daily occurrence. And I do that for the people around me, but I also do it because it's reciprocal. It means I live in a niche where speaking about things that are most valued is a regular occurrence.
Yeah, so thinking of ACT as mental niche construction, I think, is something there's really lots of food for thought there.
Yeah, I love that, and I love that. Aaron sort of cast it in terms of that. And that is, going to be in my next workshop, in about 3 or 4 days. So.
Aaron, do you want to add to this thread, please?
Yeah, it's very cool. I've basically done the same thing that Kelly has to my own life, constructing my own niche and realizing I have to prioritize myself, especially now that I have kids. They're starting to get a little bit older, so it's easier. I'm not so having to micromanage their schedule. And I do talk about the immense stress that modern day nuclear family parents have in a nuclear family, disconnected from extended family and the village in our modern day, especially when children are preschool to early elementary age. It's a really challenging time. And I had to really pull back and realize that, all right, what's important to me is not how many publications I get per year. Of course, running my lab, and I have a nice lab, is important, and that's a priority. And I make sure the students are engaged and I'm there for them, but I also want to be there for my children, and I also want to be there for me. And I had to learn to reprioritize and constantly ask myself, what are my priorities? This thing comes across my email. Do you want to review this? Or something else comes up, a service item. And I have to think, do I want to prioritize that in my life? Or if somebody cuts me off in traffic, I might think, am I going to allow myself to get angry now? Or do I want to focus on it differently, think about it differently, that would be beneficial to myself? So I've trained myself, I've redesigned and engineered my environment around me. And that's great. I can do that. Kelly can do that. You can do that. We kind of are at the forefront of the kind of people who have the luxury of taking this into their own hands. And I think we need to be able to package this kind of approach, the ACT model and other approaches, mindfulness, and bring it more to the blue collar areas, white collar areas, people who are living in food deserts where they don't have access to anything but convenience marts. And it's hard for them to make decisions when they have work in a couple of jobs, they have children that they're trying to meet rent every month to month. And there's a lot of Americans and people in other parts of the world that live like this, that don't have as much of a luxury to do like the way we're approaching this, evaluating and reconstructing our niche. So I think that's what I wanted to say is this comes to the other point, I think, and this comes back to the work you've done, David, is that we also, what I'd like to see happen is for us scientists and evolutionary scientists to help influence the way that our environments are built at a societal level, both at the local scale, like in your neighborhood project, up through a global scale, to that state, national, and beyond. And I think to influence those systems so that they can start thinking about evolutionary mismatch and revise themselves and implement changes to reduce that mismatch and make it more conducive to a healthy population, I think is something we need to get that message out. And that's a tricky one. That's where we're going to meet the most resistance, I think, because it's kind of, in a way, it's fighting the establishment.
Well, I'm actually optimistic about that. Let me take my piece. Another personal testimony that although I still don't feel I know whether, my gluten-free diet is doing anything for me, I'm convinced that ACT is doing something for me. That as I soak this stuff up, then I'm employing this basically, it's second nature for me. And I'm very confident, not that I can prove it, that ACT training has caused me to function better as a person. And although I don't have personal proof, people like Steve Hayes has provided proof. He has 2 papers on what he calls bibliotherapy, which is that his book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, he assigned that to 2 challenged populations of people. One was Japanese students studying in America, highly stressed population, and the other was teachers, K-12 teachers suffering from burnout, and there's getting into your more blue-collar population, Aaron, and he did a wait-listed treatment. One group read it first, and then the second group read it later, and he watched the numbers go down or up in terms of basically increased well-being, just on the basis of reading the book. So there's a lot of proof, and in fact, less ambiguous more solid proof than we'd probably get from such things as dietary trials, because I think that there's something going on here which is actually quite general and therefore less contextual, as opposed to this process of managing the evolutionary process. It seems to me that that's something that in a sense can benefit just about anybody. And you could think of it as a form of solving mismatch, but you can also think of it as a form of niche construction, which is not exactly the same. In fact, it's not at all the same as solving mismatch. So this is all very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the end game is going to be about niche construction. I don't want to go back to the savannah. I don't want to bury half of my children. Before.
Neither do I. No.
I mean, so it's absolutely about creating this world in such a way. I mean, like, the good news is, just because you don't have to run anymore doesn't mean that you can't run. If I get to choose between running to keep from getting eaten by a lion or running to optimize my mental health, I'll choose the latter. Thank you very much. I think that there are some means of dissemination. These things are going to have to be tinkered. There's another bibliotherapy book out there by John Forsythe that John has some data on in the anxiety area that's very nice. There have been some online studies of ACT, where people made 8 visits on average to a site, and Jonathan Brickard doubled the number of people who quit smoking over the National Cancer Institute's data set. I think, and a number of the studies that are out there are these highly health relevant behaviors, So, I mean, there's a kind of a blunt instrument version of even the things like diet. Like if you just take people and just do one thing, stop eating extrinsic sugars or stop eating seed oil. Now, that's kind of a trick, because if you stop eating seed oil, you basically just stopped eating anything with a label on it. But if it gets people reading labels and like that, it's a blunt instrument thing. I think if we get ACT protocols linked up to some of these relatively blunt instrument, kinds of lifestyle changes, there's some potential to collect some real world kind of data there.
And let me mention prosocial in that regard. So, which is basically a method for working with any group, and has a ton of data capture, and includes an ACT component at the very beginning. Is before you can change your group for the better, you need to be more flexible in a general sense. So first there's an ACT piece, then there is a review of the design principles, which we think is the group blueprint for groups to function well, and tons of data capture throughout. So actually prosocial is an example of this. And I think that, again, there's something so general about this that it's not as contextual, it's not as idiosyncratic as some other things in which it depends, so very much on context. There's a sense in which all groups can benefit from this. That's what we say, and all individuals can benefit from ACT, and there's a logic to that, basically.
Well, that's certainly what we're shooting for, is the most general, principles.
Yeah.
And at the Ancestral Health Symposium that we have every year, it's totally not about paleo reenactment. We want to have our modern lifestyles, but be healthy in them. So we want to leverage our modern technologies and embrace them, but in a way that builds us up and strengthens us and makes us have more fun.
Yeah. Okay. Well, gentlemen, this has been great. I'm so happy to have captured it.